whenever there is interfaith dialogue, there is an invisible third person present. And by that, he was not meaning, that God is present. Or he was speaking on a different level. He said, there are the two, let's say, two faith traditions represented, so to say, by two different people. And he said, there's a third presence, and that presence is modernity, secularity, science. All of that, which it's sort of the atmosphere which everyone is breathing today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Free Radical Podcast. Today, I had the great fortune and honor of meeting and interviewing a very appreciated elder, scholar, and Gaudiya Vaishnava teacher, Krishna-ksetra Swami. Krishna-ksetra Swami is a disciple of Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and he serves as an initiating guru within his mission. Encouraged by senior Vaishnavas, he resumed formal academic studies in 1995, completing a PhD at the University of Oxford's Theology Faculty in 2004. He has since taught at institutions including the University of Florida, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the University of Pula in Croatia. Krishna-ksetra Swami is a fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics and published the academic monograph Cow Care in Hindu Animal Ethics in 2020. He's currently writing another book related to this topic titled Yoga and Animal Ethics. His ongoing interests include interreligious dialogue and comparative theology, with a focus on contemplative practices and interfaith reflection. He has led seminars on these themes and continues to engage in related scholarship. For those who are interested in knowing more about Maharaj, I'm sharing here his website, which is krsna-ksetra with w.com. KRK for Krishna-ksetra Swami.com. So we have a very beautiful conversation with Maharaj centered around the theme, as you will see, of dialogical Vaishnavism, what it means to really engage in dialogue, not only with other traditions, with other faiths, but with other members of our own community, with ourselves, and how the nature of the whole of reality is actually dialogical, based on interconnectedness and relationality and reciprocity. So it has been a very amazing, astonishing conversation, exploring all the possible, or many of the possible facets of dialogue and conversation. So we invite you now to this dialogue. This is a Free Radical Podcast, and to support it, please subscribe to our channel by clicking on the bell. And if you feel inspired, touched by the conversation, feel free to share it, to like it, to drop your thoughts in the comments to keep the dialogue and the conversation ongoing. So without further ado, dear friends, brothers and sisters, here is Krishna-ksetra Swami. So Krishna-ksetra Maharaj, thank you so much for joining us in the Free Radical Podcast. It's my honor and joy and happiness to have you here. Welcome.
My pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Maharaj. And I always like to recall briefly how the timeline of my friendship and connection with each one of my guests. And if my memory doesn't fail, probably we met first time in Sadhu Bhavan in Poland on a retreat, and we had shared some days together, which was very nice. And I recall that from that connection, you used to visit Argentina, the country I was born, and at one point I felt very inspired with your connection, so I asked you if you would like to visit our local community there. And I was not there, but somehow we were able to arrange for you to go and speak to them. I remember they told me it was very, very inspiring. And of course, then you were generous enough to accept to my invitation of writing the foreword to my first book, Inherent or Inherited. So I was really touched and by your generosity. And now at present, when we are recording this conversation, I end up being at the house of one of your disciples. So somehow or other, it's a very interesting connection that is unfolding.
So many
So I'm
different
very honored to
connections.
yeah. Thank you so much, Maharaj. So I also like to ask each one of my guests also like a way of setting the sankalpa, so to say, before starting, like the intention that why are you here today? So far, I mean, of course, you are kind enough to accept so far all of my invitations, but in particular, what brings you today to this particular conversation, if we may be able to know?
I believe we decided between us that a possible interesting topic could be what I like to call dialogical Vaishnavism. And so
Yes.
that's basically it, the idea of cultivating a culture of dialogue within the Vaishnava community or communities. So I think that's our topic for today.
That's our topic for today. You nail it, as they will say in the US. So thank you so much for that. And of course, for me, the podcast I have and it's all about dialogue. It's all about conversation. And I personally, I'm quite attracted to what sometimes is called interfaith dialogue, or exchanges with members of different traditions. But I would like first to begin with, if you can define for us a little bit more specifically, if you will, what's for you dialogical Vaishnavism? Although every one of us may have an idea by the name of it, but what's your understanding and implications of dialogical Vaishnavism, like a definition to begin with?
Okay, I would say that the notion of dialogical Vaishnavism is something of a reaction to what I observe as something like the opposite of that. Of course, you could say the opposite of a dialogue is a monologue, which means one is speaking alone, and there's no communication. Although in drama there can be a monologue, which is, you could say, addressed to the audience. The notion of dialogue is, I think it's an obvious enough term. It means there's some communication going on which goes in two directions. We in the tradition that I've kind of grown up in, of Vaishnavism, as a follower of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, where he emphasized very much preaching. Preaching always was a term used in a very positive sense, as spreading the teachings of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who we take as the founder of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, rooted, you could say, geographically in Bengal, in Gauda Desh. Taking that word preach or preaching in a positive sense is how it's taken, you could say, within our community or communities for the most part. And yet, I think many also recognize that the term has a very strong negative connotation, And we have this expression in English, don't preach to me. And by that, we have the sense of someone resisting being told this is the truth, this is the way things are, and if you are at all wise, you will accept what I say basically without argument, without any kind of response, really, except to say, I accept.
Without critical thinking. Yeah.
Yes, possibly without critical thinking and so on. So I think of dialogical Vaishnavism as, in very broad terms, as a culture, a kind of culture of openness, which is based on a maturity of Vaishnava practice, of what we like to call Krishna conscious practice, a maturity which is strong enough that one is comfortable with or is not disturbed or does not feel threatened by hearing about and hearing others' perspectives. On the contrary, one is looking for ways of deepening one's own understanding, one's own conviction, one's own realization of ultimate reality, of religious truth, by hearing and engaging with others in their traditions. So that would be maybe one way of putting it.
Thank you, Maharaji. There are so many points that you have touched on that I like to comment. I will limit myself to a few of them because they are very interesting. First of all, what you mentioned,
can be a dialogue.
How somehow yes, it will be very ironical and contradictory if we just have one-way street conversation today. But yeah, I agree. Yesterday we were talking with the devotees here how sometimes in the name of a conversation we are just having simultaneous monologues instead of real dialogue, instead of the openness to hear. And I like to touch upon that later today, like which are the implications of listening to others openly and why we may be terrified about opening in that direction. But I appreciate what you mentioned about how your conception, so to say, of dialogical Vaishnavism has been like a reaction to witnessing the opposite, so to say, and many times in the name of Vaishnavism or in the name of other traditions, in the name of communication and dialogue. It reminds me of what I wrote my second book, Radical Personalism, in part at least, was a reaction or response to witnessing so many shades of impersonalism happening in the name of personalism. So somehow I connected with that. And I agree with what you mentioned. I was thinking you mentioned the word preaching, and as you say, it's a very loaded term generationally, historically. And as I recall, Madhavananda Prabhu, with whom I think recently you shared a lecture during Janmashtami, he will make this point that actually the actual word for preaching, the original term, so to say, is prachar. And as we know, prachar refers to a special type, of achar, of conduct,
Yes.
of behavior.
Yes.
So that behavior entails dialogue, entails listening, entails openness, and preaching. If we translate prachar as preaching, therefore, should not be limited to a monologue, because as you say, sometimes preaching is, I just tell you the truth, I just throw up on you revelation, and your role is basically to accept it without much consideration but thinking, and it's not dialogical in that case. So I was thinking about the importance of conceiving preaching as a dialogue, as a conversation, as a sharing of hearts, and not just a one way street.
Yes.
Yeah.
I sometimes like to bring up the image of the bridge. We have in recent years heard the expression bridge preaching, and some Christian devotees are not so happy with that idea because it implies for them some sort of potential deviation from the strict philosophy, theology of Vaishnavism. But I like to say that all preaching, if it's effective, is bridge preaching. And that of our Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, the founder Acharya of bridge preaching is Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He was building bridges, and he was having dialogues with others, and so on. There's a nice
Thank you for that particular take. Sorry. Yeah.
There's a nice expression.
No, I was just appreciating your use of the word spirit. Please continue, Maris. Sorry.
Oh, okay. There's a nice expression of how a Vaishnava might experience others' practice of religion, written by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in, I believe, the late 19th century. If I can read this. First, he lists five.
Please. Yeah.
He lists five sorts of difference among different religious traditions. And then he says, because of the above five differences, it is only natural that the various religions will appear quite different. However, it is improper and detrimental to argue over these differences. If one goes to another place of worship, one should think, the people here are worshiping my Lord, but in a different way. Because of my different training, I cannot properly comprehend this system of worship. The Lord is only one, not two. Therefore, I offer respect to the form I see here and pray to the Lord in this new form that he may increase my love for him in the form to which I am accustomed. So I've always been struck by this expression of openness from Bhaktivinoda Thakur as kind of setting a pace and really a challenge and a standard for Vaishnavas of the present time. He also uses sometimes an interesting expression, sadagrahi Vaishnava, that what a Vaishnava should be aiming for is to become a sadagrahi Vaishnava, where the word sadagrahi means one who grasps the essence of things. And so I think he is very much a pace setter in this regard.
Yeah. Totally, Maharaj. It's beautiful because 2 days ago we were celebrating the appearance day of Bhaktivinoda Thakur,
Hmm.
and I was invited to share a few words, and I basically repeated what you say just now.
Oh,
I basically referred to that specific quote, which I actually included in my second book, Radical Personalism.
uh-huh.
I just shared that exact same quote of Bhaktivinoda
Yeah.
Thakur, explaining how to how to experience other forms of worship, and then in that connection referring to the notion of saragrahi, no, and how we are invited to grasp the essence of everything and everyone, and also we were talking how, okay, he's in one sense the father of our family, if we want to put it from one place, in the sense that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur say we belong to the Bhaktivinoda Paribar,
Hmm.
the family of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and as you beautifully said, he's the pace setter. And of course, in a day like his appearance day, the other day we were wondering, like I show up to a birthday party with some gift. So what's my gift to Bhaktivinoda Thakur on his birthday, so to say? And generally the question is, how can I, as he set the pace and interacted in that way, how can I do that myself now, in the here
Hmm.
and now, and interact with modernity and with zeitgeist that I'm surrounded by, and properly represent him? So,
Hmm.
and yeah, I agree so much about dialogue. His contribution is so much about dialogue. And what I'm thinking, Maharaj, I always like to think about dialogue as like like it's the very nature of reality, in the sense of, I like to speak about the nature of reality as relational. No?
Hmm.
Like everything is connected with the common center, with Krishna in the center. So in that sense, everything is interconnected with that common center, and
Hmm.
therefore there's relationality all around, which is another way of me for me to speak about dialogue. No?
Hmm.
Relationality, interconnectedness, this
Yes.
notion of sambandha, right? Like everything is bandha, everything is bonded together,
Everything's
everything is
bound.
connected with Krishna in the center.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. It's a play, and
Yeah,
I
you
like to
could
think like that.
say
Reality, in that sense, if reality is, sorry, yeah, yeah.
you could say then there's an ontological or a metaphysical basis for dialogue in acknowledging
Hmm.
or recognizing relationality as fundamental. Yeah.
Beautifully put. You put it way better than I did in that
Oh,
sutra. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And in that sense, I like to think, yeah, reality is like an ongoing conversation. No? If we continue the idea of interconnectedness, dialogue, back and forth, reciprocity. So I like to think about that. Reality is like an ongoing conversation. I remember Viktor Frankl saying beautifully, it's not so much what I expect from life, but what life expects from me. Like making the point, there is a dialogue going on. It's
mm,
not just me expecting, requesting, but there's also another voice trying to reach us. Now, reality is always reciprocal and never a one-way street. Let's put it that way. And
yes.
and for me, that's also a profound basis for personalism, right? Because personalism is also acknowledging there is someone else out there, so to say. It's not just me and
Hmm.
nothing, nobody else. And I recall how
Yes.
Teresa de Avila, the Christian mystic, she will say like, uh, the trouble most of us have with prayer is that we pray as if God is absent. No, like there's nobody else
Uh,
on the other side. There's no dialogue. It's just me doing
yes.
my thing, so to say. So there's no
Yeah. Yeah.
conversation. It's a form of impersonalism, so to say.
Yes. Assuming that God is not present, how do I pray to him?
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or that assumption is often there. Um, what might be interesting to listeners, some may have have doubts or objections to the idea of engaging in dialogue, as if one is a practicing Vaishnava, one may say, well, no, we don't do dialogue. There's no point in that because we already have the absolute truth and we are practicing the absolute truth. Our duty, our business is to give that to others, to share that with others. So we're on the giving end and they're on the receiving end. Perhaps one, I remember one statement by Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. He was speaking to some Indian students in Berkeley, California. And he was seeing that they are all studying technology, Western technology. And he said, so you have come for this technology. That means that you are beggars. And then to contrast himself with these Indian students, because they will see he is also from India, he says, I am not a beggar. I am a giver. And so in that way, he highlighted his self-perception as there's givers and there's beggars. And he said, I'm in the category of giver, which is very nice. He is preaching giving Krishna consciousness. And so someone might say, yes, that should be our position. Our business is preaching, not, trying to make some sort of interactive thing. If there's going to be some interaction, so might be the argument, the Purva Paksha, then our business is not dialogue so much as debate. We should be debating, not dialoguing. Another way this might be put is, if we are listening to others, doesn't that mean that we are relativizing or watering down the philosophy or the theology of Vaishnavism? And can this not lead to confusion? And another or related objection could be, isn't interfaith dialogue a waste of time since no one changes their position? So
thanks for bringing all that shower of Purva Paksha to the table.
Yeah, I listed these as Purva Paksha. And of course, Purva Paksha is the preliminary position. I can't say that I have worked out a systematic Siddhanta in reply to that, but I think this would be a kind of starting point if one finds oneself in a position of, let's say, contestation of the whole project of interfaith or interreligious dialogue. I think one general response to this could be reflected in a point made by Professor Francis X. Clooney at Harvard University. He was my doctoral supervisor at Oxford. I was very fortunate in this regard. And he has written extensively on not so much interfaith dialogue as comparative theology. He is a Roman Catholic theologian who studies and reflects deeply on and writes about mainly Vaishnava tradition, in particular South Indian Sri Vaishnava traditions. But I was just reading one of his somewhat more recent books, I think, a kind of introduction to comparative theology. And one of the first points he makes is that diversity is all around us. That more and more in modern or late modern or postmodern times, however we might want to call it, people have all kinds of people are representing or belonging to all sorts of traditions. And it's just a matter of recognizing that, acknowledging that, and engaging with that reality. But he goes a step further. He says, there is diversity. We are surrounded by diversity. And he says, there's also within ourselves, there is diversity, in effect. In other words, by virtue of the fact that we are exposed to all sorts of ideas, by virtue of the fact that we are reflective beings, you really cannot find any one person who is a sort of mono culture unto themselves. All of us are sort of a combination of so many thoughts, so many experiences, so many ideas, and perhaps mixtures of things, of ideologies. So I would say that one of a starting point of responding to the naysayer to Vaishnava dialogue would simply be look around yourself and look inside yourself and see all the variety that is there and acknowledge it.
Yeah. Thank you. I couldn't avoid thinking about one conversation that I had last year with Srivatsa Goswami that I know you're familiar with,
Yes.
of course.
Yeah.
And you've had some interesting conversations. I've seen some of your conversations with him of the Bhagavatam that were shared publicly and so on.
Yeah.
And we were talking about different influences, even cultural influences, and for example, their standard of worship at Radharaman Mandir, which in one sense is a very traditional lineage, if you will. And he will show me with his cell phone, which in itself it starts to speak about a globalized world, like a Goswami from Radharaman having a cell phone. And he's showing from his cell phone a picture of the daily darshan of Sri Radharaman. And he was wearing he shows two pictures, one of Radharaman dressed like a Mughal king. So he's showing me, Maharaj, this is not Vedic. He's not Vedic, but he looks beautiful, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the ultimate consideration. He's so charming. And another one is like he's in shorts here. He's wearing shorts. That's not coming from any Indian tradition, but look how cute he looks. So I couldn't avoid thinking
Yeah.
about that, no? Like how he was
Yes.
acknowledging, as you mentioned, the diversity and the various currents of influence and culture and the possibility of integration in a level that is not, how to say, compromising our
Yeah.
principles, but ideally enhancing the experience
Enhancing.
of our own tradition.
Yes. Speaking of Radharaman, perhaps you've also seen
Uh-huh.
these photos from, I think they were made in 1916. Two photos that the Radharaman Padmanabh Goswami showed me. Of one is
Mm-hmm.
showing they created a facade in the front of the altar like a large battleship, and in the middle was prominently placed the deity Radharaman. So he was like the captain of the ship. Um, and there was an interesting political message across uh, the the front of this ship, because this was, of course, during World War One. So the message was, I forget the words, but something wishing well to our king. They were wishing well to the British king. And another photo shows Radharaman on like a choo-choo train they created. So I think they have
Really?
also quite a sense of humor in that community, which is nice.
Yes. Hasya rasa is always an important consideration.
Yes, it's very much part of our tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Regarding Maharaj, the Purva Paksha, the different forms of Purva Paksha that you mentioned, and as you mentioned, there's so much to say in order to make a systematic reply and Siddhantic reply to that. But of course, every time I hear Purva Paksha, I feel I try to I like to think of Purva Paksha as ideal Purva Paksha as a genuine concern coming from the Purva
Mm-hmm.
Pakshi. No, if we are talking among
Mm.
members of our own community and not so much like debating with someone else from another tradition and trying to defeat in debate, but just from the members of one same community, when Purva Paksha comes, I try to take it as okay, some genuine concern of how to do things
Yeah.
properly, honoring uh, tradition, legacy, not compromising, not watering down, and not necessarily like
Mm.
just sheer opposition, blind denial. So I took all those three Purva you mentioned, like genuine concern, which there's a big place for that. But yeah, at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a big place to have a dialogue and a conversation about the place of dialogue, to have dialogue about dialogue and dialogue outside of our tradition and dialogue inside of our tradition. In my personal experience that I try to refer to in my second book again, I've had very interesting experiences with members of other traditions in which, how to say, I was able not to. I don't feel that I have compromised my own views on Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but I think that I've been enriched and my appreciation of my own tradition following the quote that you shared before of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, by witnessing their form of worship or by witnessing their faith, by hearing their thoughts, although we may have some differences, somehow or other I've returned to my tradition enriched and with a new perspective to further appreciate my own school. So for me, my conclusion is if another quote unquote tradition is helping me to rediscover, so to say, my own tradition, how
Right.
much can I speak in terms of another tradition? How thick is the line, the divide line between one tradition and the other, where at the same time there is so much in common? There are
Yeah.
differences, but there's so much in common. There is the possibility of helping each other to rediscover our own particular faith, right?
Yeah.
Don't know if you have any
Exactly.
thoughts on that.
Actually, that's a point that Frank Clooney makes
Mm.
in much of his work on comparative theology, that his starting point is his own faith tradition. And he, in effect, ventures out and he goes deeply into another tradition in order to then come back to his own tradition with a fresh perspective, by which to go deeper into his own tradition. And so he tries to model that and show how it can be done, particularly by studying written texts of other traditions, and then comparing them with with texts that he finds some parallel with in his own tradition. I wanted to say also, to this point of coming back or being enriched by dialogue, I think a major element is skill. That dialogue is a kind of skill that, like any skill, it can be learned, and it can be practiced, and practice there can be mistakes made in practice, and then from that practice one learns for a future event, and so on. But for me, the idea of skill also points to the value of making some effort, making some effort to study another tradition, possibly, so to say, in advance of meeting people live, so that one has one has already some literacy in that tradition. In my case, if I would have interfaith dialogue, some sort of occasion with, let's say, someone from the Islamic tradition, first of all, I realize how little I know about Islam. I've taught a course in university, Religions of India, in which I spoke in one, I think maximum 2 lectures about Islam in India, and I pretty much exhausted everything that I knew about Islam in those 1 or 2 lectures. And yet we know the writings of Islam are vast, as they are for any tradition, or if one just starts with the Quran, that's already a major challenge to read, to appreciate, and so on. But what I'm saying is, I think dialogue can be benefited by some effort to become at least minimally knowledgeable about a tradition that one is encountering other than one's own. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, there are a few thoughts, Maharaj. Thanks for sharing that. And I was thinking when you mentioned about the importance of having some preliminary literacy, so to say, before an encounter, also as a way of showing respect to the person I am to meet. No? Like showing some honor to the person and the tradition by taking the time of grasping on some level, as you mentioned, what they are about. Recently, I've been visiting Italy, and we spent one day going to Assisi, to Saint Francis Dham, so
Oh,
to
yes.
say. and
Yeah.
and of course, I am familiar with his. Of course, one day was not enough. We were like overwhelmed with the incredible amount of input that we were receiving in that place, and we felt this needs at least a week to properly ruminate and process and live the experience. But what I was thinking
Yeah.
now is like, of course, I am familiar with St. Francis and his tradition and their philosophy, but for someone who may come without knowing anything. They may like the place, okay, this is San Francis, but the situation will be different. Of course, I'm not talking here, they're talking with someone else in dialogue, but they're somehow having a dialogue with Franciscan Christianity by visiting a place like that, or by someone going to Vrindavan without knowing too much. Of course, if there's openness, there will be inspiration, connection, bhakti samskars. But if one is way more familiar, I'm sure the experience will be enhanced, so to say. So, what to speak if we are having a personal conversation with someone, and someone that
Yeah.
came something that came to my mind also is not only taking the time to develop the skill and becoming familiar uh, with the other person and the other tradition, but also, as you mentioned also before, go on quoting Francis X. Clooney, like before going to other tradition and returning enriched to mine, so to say, I may need to take first of all some time to become familiar with my own tradition. Because if
Yes.
I'm not engaging in dialogue, I'm not engaging in dialogue with my own tradition or with myself in my tradition. uh, I may go to other traditions as yes, get confused, not have a clear demarcation about what's this, what's that. So I like to use
Yeah.
the term, apart from interfaith dialogue, like talking with other traditions, intra-faith dialogue, like having a dialogue
Yes.
with my own tradition. So,
Yes.
so first I can have intra-faith dialogue, become properly rooted in my own school,
Yeah.
then have interfaith dialogue, and then have a further intra-faith dialogue, enriched by what I receive from my interfaith dialogue.
Yes. No, that's there. And this, mm, it reminds me of something that has come up in seminars. I've given seminars on um, what I call dialogical Vaishnavism. I've given seminars amongst
Mhm.
Vaishnavas, amongst people of my own community, um, and
Mhm.
something that comes up um, all the time is, oh, we don't even know how to dialogue amongst ourselves.
Yes.
We don't
Yes.
even know how to
Yeah.
communicate
That's what.
in our own temple.
Yeah. Yeah.
What to speak
Yeah.
of,
And that's
that
kind
could
of,
be another
yeah.
purva paksha of why not to do dialogue outside. We have to first learn how to do it ourselves.
Yeah, totally. For me, when you told me dialogical Vaishnavism, my main idea was like dialogical Vaishnavism. Let's have a dialogue with Vaishnavism. We are Vaishnavas. Let's have a dialogue with our own community, with our own self as Vaishnavas,
Yeah,
and only then we can
yeah,
try to
that's
talk
of
to
course.
others. Because
Yeah,
yeah, sometimes I find this like strange situation where I see devotees engaging in, let's call it interfaith dialogue, and being nice and talking with other traditions, but they are not able to talk with members of their own traditions or with other missions or groups from Gaudiya Vaishnavism. No,
yes.
in that department there is struggle, there is denial of conversation, but with other traditions there is a very nice interaction. So
One
sometimes I
reason,
ask myself that why we sometimes have better conversations with them than
yeah.
with Gaudias, which are in one sense even closer to us, if you will.
Well, one explanation of that has been given, perhaps by Sigmund Freud. I forget which book it is. He
Hmm.
mentions what he calls, I think he calls it the narcissism of the slight difference. The narcissism of the slight or the minor difference. So when there's a minor difference, we tend to make it a very big difference. Because of narcissism, we tend to be self-absorbed. We want to identify with a certain position, and that's what can make intra religious dialogue especially difficult and especially challenging. And of course, there is, we might want to say, a political issue. There's a sense that if we have differences, those differences in understanding are going to have political implications in terms of, grouping and membership and who is a follower of whom and so on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had some first-hand experience with my first book in that connection. Uh, Not to go into the details of that, but of
Yes.
course, it was widely appreciated by many. But at the same time, I could see how, on a more sociological level, it triggered in some cases this type of reactions
Yeah.
and all the implications that you are referring to, which I mean, at the time, I will say I was naive on certain level in terms of that potential triggering.
Mm.
And that was a big lesson for me to witness. But
Yeah.
yeah, I can see that why sometimes, as you say, differences among members of the same tradition can become so heated. I'm also thinking that maybe, and you let me know your thoughts, but having a dialogue with someone from other traditions is more kind of, it feels more safe in the
Mm.
sense of, okay, I have my tradition, you have your tradition.
Yeah.
So there's not that much of a perceived threat because I have my conclusions.
Yeah.
But when that happens among members of the same tradition, then may be more challenging
Yes.
to my own set of beliefs. And, and,
Yes.
and sometimes I may be challenged in a necessary way. I may need to be challenged and to review my thoughts, but it
Yeah.
may feel quite dangerous. So I may have a more defensive stance in that direction.
Yes, exactly. We become defensive. Yes, that's true. Um,
Hmm.
I want to pick up a thought related to the difficulty of intrafaith dialogue in relation to
Yes,
interfaith
yes,
dialogue.
please.
Um, I was I was doing my master's degree course in study of religion at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley several years ago, and I attended one lecture uh, of one professor whose name is slipping my mind just at the moment. Let me see if I have it here. Who made a point that always stuck with me, and that is, yes, Professor Sayed Hussein Nasser made an interesting point. He said, interfaith dialogue, whenever there is interfaith dialogue, there is an invisible third person present.
Hmm.
And by that, he was not meaning, that God is present. Or, he was speaking on a different level. He said, there are
Hmm.
the two, let's say, two faith traditions represented, so to say, by two different people. And he said, there's a third um, presence, and that presence is modernity, secularity, science.
Hmm.
All of that, which it's sort of the atmosphere which everyone is breathing today.
Hmm.
And so when one is engaged, whether it's intra or interfaith,
Hmm.
it's may be helpful, it may be necessary, in fact, to sort of acknowledge explicitly that we're doing this discussion within a certain atmosphere.
Yeah,
And one
yeah.
could argue that that atmosphere is even facilitating the dialogue, by which I mean,
Hmm.
some religious traditional cultures of earlier times, some centuries ago, there would have been no question of, discussion of the sorts we may be uh, talking about here. Anyway, I just think it's helpful to keep in mind, yes, there's a third partner in the discussion who is sort of maybe just lurking in the background, but somehow needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah, thank you. Somehow I connect that what you mentioned before, quoting Francis Clooney on diversity and the diversity that is there outside and inside of us, and how that's brought to the table when we are having these conversations, like different influences
Yeah,
playing themselves out,
yes.
and the importance, as you mentioned, to make an effort to explicitly acknowledge that third guest, so to say, and
Mm-hmm.
not only as you say, as a phantom, as a ghost lurking in the back, but also as a potential facilitator, right? So
Yes,
with
yeah.
gratitude, even like, I don't know, even to say, as you say, that guest is science. To give an example, due thanks to science, we have
Mm.
technology, and thanks to technology, I can have this conversation with you and so many other people. To give one example
Yes,
of that. So thank you,
yes,
third
exactly.
guest, for your presence.
Yeah.
Maharaj, I was also thinking in connection to interfaith dialogue. I remember talking with a friend of mine to my podcast. I used to bring members from the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, but also I've brought people like Richard Rohr, Franciscan author, or Elia Delio, she's a
Mm-hmm.
Franciscan nun, and also Jewish
Mm-hmm.
rabbis, and people from other traditions. And I really enjoy those conversations. And many times we have these beautiful moments of like epiphany, like where I remember I always quote this example talking with Elia Delio. She's a Franciscan nun, theologian, and scientist. And
Mm-hmm.
I was somehow the topic of Lila came, so I was unfolding what Lila means, and Lila as a celebratory movement, and so on and so forth, not as a forced action like karma, so to say. And she was just nodding all the time. And at one point, she tells me, I think I'm a Hindu. Mhm. Because I basically agree with everything you're saying. So that was his way of putting it. No, and of course, I naturally told her, well, when I hear you explaining your theology with your such a broad mindedness, I think I'm a Christian. No, so we were kind
Yeah.
of acknowledging there are differences for sure, but there's such a common foundation, if we want to use our Bhagavad language, Advai Gyan Tattva, our non-dual consciousness as a foundation for reality, that when we are properly grounded in that commonality, whatever differences may come on top of that will be perceived and experienced as ornaments, ideally, not as potential like clashing element, but as an ornament, as an alankar, so to say, if there is a
Mm.
proper establishing of the common foundation we share. So on
Mm.
that connection, I was talking with a friend of mine who also engages a lot in interfaith dialogue. In the past, he has done that with Thomas Keating and Dalai Lama and other personalities. They
Mm.
organize. He told me that Thomas Keating organizes a series of snow mass meetings. That was the name of the retreats for many years. Maybe you've heard about that. And he told me that the main, how to say, the main mood of those gatherings, which were not like public, but he will invite members of different traditions, and there will be basically maybe 10 maximum, and get together for, I don't know, 1 week or two. And
Mm.
instead of sharing like, okay, this is my official theology, this is my official philosophy, they will more share which is my inner experience of my
Mm.
tradition. So it was more a sharing
Mm.
of inner experiences than a like official presentation of one's dogma,
Mm.
so to say. I don't know which thoughts
Yeah.
you have in connection to that undialogical Vaishnavism.
Yeah, definitely. Of course, there's so many different sorts of dialogue, and sometimes it happens one is invited to some some event, interfaith, interreligious dialogue in which it's very much expected that one is coming as a representative of some institution. And then one kind of has to go along with that. Okay, I'm a representative of an institution, and I'll do my best to do this representing. Such events I've found, not that I have a lot of experience with it, but the few times I have, my experience of those is, to put it a bit crudely perhaps, they tend to be interfaith serial monologues where first one person speaks, he or she gives, so to say, a little pitch, and then the next person gives their little pitch, and and everyone is very polite, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I once in Oxford, I was chatting with one scholar who had made it his topic of his doctoral dissertation, studying the history of interfaith dialogue. And I was just on my way to go to one such event. It was the Parliament of the World's Religions event. And so it's quite a big one. And I asked him what he thought about that. And he said, yeah, well, he said, it goes on, and that's good. The fact that it happens is the main message. So that's one level. But the other extreme, which I think is the more interesting one, is what you mentioned, where one is sharing one's own experience, one's own. And I've seen that. I was fortunate to be a participant in a small group, a dialogue. It was a Vaishnav Christian dialogue in India. And this is a group we've met a few times, and we get to know each other such that, there's a real sense of personal relationality to some extent. And I remember in one of our discussions, one of the persons who was from the Roman Catholic tradition said, almost in confidence, he said, now on this point, he said, I'm not so sure that I agree with the Vatican. Whatever it was, I don't remember what it was, but he said, I'm not so sure I agree with the Vatican. And when he said that, it was like all of us just felt immediately so much more relaxed. It was like, oh yeah, we can actually say what we think. We don't have to say what we're expected to say. And immediately I felt like the group came closer together just by that small expression of confidence in us, you could say.
Maharaj, in relation to this last thing you mentioned and how certain expressions create more willingness to be open and receive each other, for me, the notion of, as we mentioned before, when we speak about dialogue, we are speaking about dialogue, again, as you say, not monologue, but dialogue, which means not only giving myself to the other person somehow, but also receiving the other person. And for me, this receiving parallels with the notion of listening to the other person, the importance of hearing each other. And I was like this beautiful quote by Paul Tillich, the Christian theologian, that he will say that the first duty of love is to listen. And I cannot
Mm.
avoid thinking about Shravan first in the list of all these bhakti practices. It all begins by
Yeah.
properly not only listening to the name, listening to the Bhagavatam, but listening to each other, listening to ourselves, to what's going on around us, presence and listening. So, in
Mm.
connection to dialogue, and we touched a little bit upon that, uh, but for me, dialogue, real dialogue, is not only hearing each other, like diplomatically or politely, but just waiting for my turn to expose my own thing, which will be more like a jalpa thing, not so much a bada, a real conversation, but the willingness to change, being willing to change with what I receive from the other person, and also allowing the other person to change, not to like to give
Mhm.
both parts permission, so to say, to change and be
Mm.
transformed. Because, in other words, for me, interfaith dialogue should entail genuine interfaith dialogue, should entail the possibility, the genuine possibility of transformation for both parts included. Because if not, if we enter the dialogue on excessively like rigid ground, I'm already telling the other person whatever you have to share is won't will not affect my journey. Now, whatever revelations, whatever experiences you have to share will not affect my journey. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this topic of course, so much you may have to say on hearing each other, listening to each other, and not only limited to people from other traditions, but again, bringing always back to our own communities, our own dialogues, our own conversation in the Gaudiya community on the topic of listening and hearing each other, and how to say, connecting to each other rather than projecting on each other,
Mm.
like, and being willing to be
Project.
empathic and see the world from the other person's
Yeah.
uh, because sometimes we are expert in talking about other people instead of talking with other people, really.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any
Yes.
thoughts on this.
Um, well, one thought might be in using the imagery of gardening, as we know in our tradition.
Mhm,
Srila Rupa Goswami compares the process of developing bhakti as a process of gardening. There's the watering, which is compared to the hearing. Um, and in the more classical Upanishadic tradition, there's Shravanam, Mananam, and then Nididhyasanam, where
mhm,
Mananam I think of as um, a more somewhat analytical stage. I'm hearing first, and then I'm reflecting on, and that reflection, vichara, we might say, may include some
mhm,
analytical thought. It may include also comparisons of my own within my own experience, or even with things that I've heard and read from other traditions. And then there's nididhyasanam, and this I think of as digestion. So kind of changing
mm.
the analogy from gardening to eating and digesting,
From
where
we go from we go from the garden to the meal on the table, Maharaj.
yes, like that. So after having made a nice offering to Krishna, yes. So
Mhm. Yeah, of course.
so digestion is actually a quite mystical process. Uh, I think even
Mm,
the
mm,
best of biologists and physiologists don't know exactly what happens when we put food in
mm,
the mouth.
mm,
Somehow or other, it transforms, and then we have energy. Is the point? So we
mhm,
could say that
mhm,
a test for a good dialogue is that it energizes both partners in the dialogue. Because of good hearing and then good reflection, there can be some actual digestion, and then comes energy, and with energy we can do more dialogue. One form of dialogue I've wanted, I've sort of imagined doing would be an exchange which begins with, well, to keep it simple, two persons from two different traditions, each writing something, you know, not too long, but something where they're writing on the same general theme, then sharing with each other, then responding in writing to each other on what has been written by the other, and doing that, well, at least one round, but possibly like two rounds, and then meeting in person and talking about what has been expressed in writing and what reflections one has had based on that. I've sometimes thought that could be an interesting experiment as a way to go deeper in a conversation, in a dialogue, than is often possible.
Sounds totally interesting. Count of me if you need any volunteers for experiments like that. I'm ready for entering the laboratory. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Just in case. Yeah.
Yes.
Maharaji, just getting to wrapping up a few more themes before concluding. One that comes to my mind in connection, of course, with our main theme of dialogical Vaishnavism. We have what we may call the model of vertical dialogue, so to say, between like guru and disciple, Krishna, Arjun, Parikshit, Maharaj, Sukadeva Goswami, Guru Shishya type of conversation. There is this type of hierarchy between teacher and student.
Yeah.
But I also wonder about the notion of horizontal dialogue or circular instead of pyramidal, so to say, dialogue. Uh, where and I'm saying that even between guru and disciple, how much do you think there is place for that? You being an initiating spiritual master, when the guru is also learning from the disciple, or the guru is talking with the disciple,
Yeah.
not from one to one, because I can understand the position and the hierarchy, but I don't know. For example, in your personal experience, maybe I'm going here more on a personal note, how you personally live that as a guru yourself, uh, and which I think it may be an important point in relation to the question that I sometimes ask. If someone is a guru, I ask them, how do you survive as a guru? No? How do you survive being a guru in terms of keeping proper sobriety and humility and humanness and openness
Yeah.
and horizontal connections, and not only
Yeah.
being careful not to end up being isolated on the top of a pyramid. All
Yeah.
that in
Yeah.
the context of dialogue. So I don't know, any thoughts you have.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. Sometimes I find that having this designation and having that guru-disciple relation, being the guru with a disciple, can be an obstacle. It can be an obstacle because the sense of hierarchy. It's very difficult for the disciple to set that aside, even if I, try to invite, let's put aside this, uh, for some time at least. It's hard to put that aside, and so it can kind of be an obstacle preventing a disciple to kind of open up as would be beneficial for a growing, for a nurturing relationship.
Mhm.
I'm thinking now of Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, how he many times would consult with his disciples. Of course, it was not really about what we would say is philosophical or theological points. However, in practical matters, many times he would consult with disciples. He would ask, "What do you think? What should we do in this regard? What should we do here?" And so on. And that, I think you could say, is a kind of horizontality. Recently, and this is related, I think they wouldn't mind my mentioning, I was invited to attend a meeting of some of the devotee scholars who are presently working on the Temple of the Vedic Planetarium in the Chaitanya Chandrodaya Mandir in Mayapur, the museum. They are planning a very large museum of science and cosmology. And they consulted with one devotee who was serving Srila Prabhupada at the time that he was translating the fifth canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And he was translating those chapters which deal with cosmology. And the comment that this devotee made that really struck me was that Prabhupada's mood was not by any means that he has complete, clear understanding of what is described in those chapters. Rather, he said he could very well imagine Prabhupada sitting amongst those who were present at the meeting where this was being discussed. He said, I could imagine him sitting amongst us here and just listening to you and, just being one of us, trying to understand what are these incredible descriptions in the fifth canto. So that's a side of Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada that most of his followers are quite unaware of.
Yeah, which in my opinion, it adds a lot of sweetness and intimacy and human connection also with that side of him, which in my opinion,
Yes,
again, is very, very crucial, very important, very enriching to all that he
yeah,
is, right?
yes. And this reminds me also, maybe on a kind of different level, and maybe you can remind me whether it's in Jaiva Dharma or what's the other book of sort of dialogues of Bhaktivinoda Thakur,
Prem
where
Pradip.
he's, maybe it's Prema Pradipa or there's another one, I think. In any case, he's two characters, it's sort of a quasi-novel. Two characters, one is the guru, one is the disciple, and they're discussing Raga Nuga Bhakti, and the guru is suggesting to the disciple his, Ekadasha Rupa, is the 11 features of his eternal eternal form, and
Mhm.
the disciple is saying,
Mm.
I don't know if that's
It
for
doesn't work
me.
for me.
It doesn't work for me. And the guru says, oh, okay. How about this?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, let's adjust the template. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
That's
think
so
Bhaktivinoda
different.
Thakur also makes. Yeah, I think Bhaktivinoda Thakur makes that point also in Harinam Chintamani, but probably also in one of these other books you mentioned. And yeah, and that's a whole conversation, right, Maharaj? In terms of for many
Yeah,
that will kind of relativize the position of the guru, but actually there is a place to properly understand that in a way that is charming and realistic. No, it's not that we are relativizing, but probably it's that we are over absolutizing some features.
yes. One thing
Mm.
that I, one thing that may be relevant in my own, with
Mm.
relation to my own experience is something that I've been doing for some years now is encouraging disciples to write their realizations. We have an ongoing project, and you've participated. Actually, you've written for our, I think, our second canto volume, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was funny. May I say something? Because I was yesterday at the house of Anupam, your disciple, and Dina Dayal, and I was just going through the books in the bookshelf. I always am drawn there, and I see this
yeah,
second canto edition, and I was like,
uh-huh.
oh, I think I sent something to this, but probably since I didn't receive any further notification, it was not approved or whatever, which is fine. So I was just going through the list of articles and authors, and I see my name there. So I realized, oh, I ended up in the book. So I will later write to Maharaj, but you brought the topic now, and I will demand my printed copy of that edition.
Yes, you are still there at Radhadesh, is that right?
Yeah.
So please
Okay. So,
get a copy.
yeah, yeah,
Take a
totally
copy
fine,
while
Maharaj. I was
you're,
just joking. But yeah,
yeah.
glad that I'm happy and honored that I had a chance to be part of that publication. So yeah, thank you. I didn't want to divert your
So
focus.
now I can invite you to write something for our third canto project,
Okay, Maharaj, you are making it public now,
if you
so I,
like.
I cannot say no.
Yes,
Of course,
I put you on
you've
the
caught me
spot.
in public, so what can I say? Of course, your service. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so
So you
my
you were
point though
mentioning that
is
point. Yeah.
I think that this serves in some way to sort of flatten, to bring this relation, um, not exactly to a horizontal relationality,
Mm-hmm.
but in a sense, yes. And I think that's there because I also write something for these books, and it's just sort of my own reflection. And what inspires me is that I find that devotees really write wonderful insights in these written reflections.
Yeah.
So generally, we hear that, oh, don't dare to write anything unless you are, a self-realized soul. And Srila
Mm.
Prabhupada once or twice he said, um, liberation does not mean uh, having 4 heads and 8 legs, or 4 arms
Mm-hmm.
and 8 legs, or something.
Mm. Mm.
So anyway, I think you get the point.
Yeah.
It's one thing I try
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
to make
Yeah.
this a relationality which is more. It's not just hierarchical.
Yeah, thank you, Maraj. I really appreciate that, and of course, knowing you, I'm sure that you are doing the best you can to keep that relationality in a very healthy place. So that's what I thought about asking you about that, because I think it's very much needed to hear this type of receive this type of input and testimonies in this connection. Let me share one
Mhm.
short quote that I recently read from Srila Prabhupada in this connection, which is not necessarily a horizontal thing, but at the same time is very interesting. A letter that he sends to one of his disciples, and he's saying,
Mm.
and I was shocked when I read this, but it was beautifully shocked. He says, "You cannot survive without my mercy, and I cannot survive without your mercy. It is reciprocal. This mutual dependence is based on love." I almost fell to the
Ah,
ground when I read that letter. It was so touching, so incredibly beautiful. Um,
that's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah. And that keeps showing
Thank
me
you.
like a
That's
personality like Srila Prabhupada is a very multifaceted jewel, and we have to be so careful not to, yeah, limit him to whatever ideas or experiences we have about him. And he's always expert of
yeah,
surprising us and showing us a new facet and a new
yeah,
perspective.
yes.
Yeah.
And we learn so much from all these different sides of him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Totally. Okay, Maraji, I don't want to take more of your time. Thank you so much for your presence. And I would like, before we conclude and wrap up our conversation, if there are any closing, concluding thoughts you may like to share before we close the curtain on the topic of dialogue and all that we have shared today, whatever you feel inspired to share.
Um, well, the only thing I would like to kind of go back to the point of, um, let's say, interreligious literacy. Some of your
Mm-hmm.
listeners might be interested that there's, I mean, any number of books which can encourage in this direction on different levels of sort of intellectual or emotional engagement. But since I did mention my doctoral supervisor, Francis Clooney, um,
Mm-hmm.
not as a plug exactly, but he has written really wonderful books on this topic, particularly of comparative theology. And the first one, which I read, in fact, I read with a group of students with him in a seminar at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, is called Seeing Through Texts, doing theology uh, with the Sri Vaishnavas of South India, something like that
Mm-hmm.
um, title and subtitle. But the other book I mentioned, which is more general, like an introduction to comparative theology, it's just called Comparative Theology: Deep Learning Across Religious Boundaries. And he did another book which is intriguing. It's a quite different style, you could say. It's called Hindu Wisdom for All God's Children. Um, and this is, very accessible, I would say, for all kinds of readers. On, more on the side of interfaith dialogue, your listeners may or may not have heard of Dr. Ibu Patel. He
Mm-hmm.
is a kind of activist for interreligious dialogue in America. He himself is from a Muslim background, but he has an organization, Interfaith, I think it's called Interfaith America, where he gets students talking with each other about their faith. And one of his books is called Interfaith Leadership, with a subtitle, A Primer. And I think this is very, down to earth, practical. It's not Gaudiya Vaishnava by any means. It's completely, broad, from a very broad perspective. And I think he very nicely and systematically presents a case for, I think it can be an inspiration for devotees of Krishna to be thinking more about getting involved in this sort of thing.
Thank you.
Of
Thank you, Maharaj.
interest.
Yeah, totally. I took note of all of them, so I'll go through each of them. And as I think I told you, also had some connection with Francis Clooney in connection to this Hindu monastic program that they have in Harvard. So it
Yes.
has been also,
Uh-huh.
yeah. So we are having some conversation about the possibility of going through that experience myself. Let's see what happens, but it's
Uh-huh.
interesting that
Yeah.
he's connected with you as well, and all these topics are being like
Yes.
made full circle in themselves. So thanks for sharing that.
Mm.
Yeah. And thanks for blessing us with your
Good.
presence. Really, we are very happy to have you here today, and deep gratitude for the time
Thank you.
invested and sharing your insights and being a personification and example
Thank
of
you for
dialogue and
the
dialogical
opportunity.
Vaishnavism.
Yes. Let the dialogue increase.
Let the dialogue
Okay.
increase. Thank you so much, Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you all for tuning in to the Free Radical podcast. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Krishna-ksetra Maharaj on Dialogical Vaishnavism. So if you liked and enjoyed our dialogue, our interaction, please support us, support the channel, support the podcast, the project by subscribing and clicking the bell. Your likes, your shares, your comments help us to continue this dialogue, this ongoing conversation and discussions. And as I like to say, as usual, if you feel inspired, indebted, touched, and driven to somehow pay back to whatever you felt you have received today, the paying back is always in the form of paying forward, embodying the teachings, embodying the lessons, walking the talk, and extending the blessings of the gifts you have received to everyone else around you. So see you in 2 weeks for our next episode of the Free Radical podcast.